French reconnaissance planes roared over Belgium, their wings riddled with bullet holes from earlier dogfights. The pilots strained to spot movement below. Then they saw it, columns of German panzers grinding forward in tight formation. Dust billowed behind them as they advanced toward the French lines. Tracer fires shrieked past, forcing the scouts to juke and dive. They radioed back immediately, enemy armor moving in force. But confusion spread through French command. Orders clashed, delays mounted. The first German tank rolled into view, its turret pivoting toward the unprepared French positions, the first of 600 more behind it. Yellow cases and dial plans. In May 1940, Europe was on the brink of collapse, with Germany's blitzkrieg tearing through the continent and the Allies scrambling to hold the line against an unstoppable force. The German forces were preparing for Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, a strategic plan to invade France and the Low Countries using a rapid mechanized assault to bypass the heavily fortified Maginot Line. Their strategy was clear: advance through Belgium, disrupt Allied defenses at the Jean Bleu Gap, and tie down or eliminate French forces, all while the main thrust moved through the Ardennes to the Meuse River. General Walter von Reichenau's 6th Army, composed of mechanized and motorized divisions, aimed to strike swiftly, using their Luftwaffe to disrupt Allied reinforcements and maintain air superiority. While the Germans had a powerful force, including over 670 tanks, ranging from older Panzer I and II models to more formidable Panzer IIIs and IVs, their strategy hinged on speed and coordination rather than sheer strength. In contrast, the French First Army, under General Georges Blanchard, was tasked with holding the crucial Jean Bleu Gap. The French response was guided by the Dial Plan, the French strategy to defend Belgium and the Dial River to halt the German advance before retreating to the River Somme. The plan involved deploying a mix of mechanized infantry and heavy tanks, including the 1st DCR, or Heavy Armored Division, but they faced significant challenges. French forces, spread thin and lacking in anti-aircraft capabilities, struggled to prepare adequately. They were further hindered by outdated tanks like the Renault R-35, which couldn't match the mobility or firepower of the German panzers. The R-35 had 40mm cast armor, but a weak 37mm SA-18 gun, while the Panzer had thinner 30mm armor, more powerful 37 and 75mm guns, higher speed, and radios for coordination. The French infantry divisions, though skilled, were undermanned, and the French Air Force was outnumbered and underprepared, with only a handful of aircraft remaining by the time battle loomed. Despite these weaknesses, French determination held firm. Though the Germans, led by General Erich Hoppner's 16th Panzer Corps, were well equipped and bolstered by overwhelming air support, the French forces, including General René Prue's Cavalry Corps, prepared to face the impending onslaught. Dawn breaks over the Belgian countryside. On May 14, 1940, the Belgian countryside was shrouded in a thin mist as the first light of dawn broke over the fields. The rumble of German tanks reverberated through the earth, signaling the beginning of the assault. The 4th and 3rd Panzer divisions, led by General Hoppner, had gathered their strength to strike at the heart of the French defense. The goal was clear: break through the French lines and push them back before they could organize a solid resistance. The Germans had already been sweeping across Europe, and this battle was no different, fast and brutal. Finally, at 6 a.m., the order was given. The tanks moved forward, their treads tearing through the soft earth. The 35th Panzer Regiment's 8th Company led the charge, roaring toward the railway south of Vernage, with 30 tanks in total. The growl of their engines mixed with the shrill sound of aircraft as the Luftwaffe flew overhead, scanning for targets. But there was no immediate resistance. The French, unaware of the full scale of the assault, were still in a defensive posture. By 9:20 a.m., French reconnaissance planes, battered by the constant pressure from German fighters, had spotted the advancing tanks. They radioed back urgently, but the French command was disjointed. The French defenders, positioned along the dial line, braced for impact. French anti-tank guns were manned, and their crews stood by, waiting for the first targets to emerge from the mist. But the Germans were already moving swiftly, using their superior mobility to avoid most of the mines and obstacles set up in the previous days. Suddenly, the first artillery shell screamed through the air toward the panzers. The Germans had underestimated the range and precision of French anti-tank artillery. Within minutes, explosions erupted across the battlefield. The 35th Panzer Regiment's lead tanks were struck by 75mm shells, which tore through their armor with ease. 9 German panzers were knocked out in those first few minutes. The 6th Company, which had been expected to provide support, was now stuck in place, pinned down by relentless artillery fire. The first wave had failed. The Germans were not fully prepared for the strength of the French defenses, and the cost of that miscalculation was already apparent. After about 2 hours of biding their time and planning their next move, the Germans were getting ready to push forward again at 11:30 a.m. Except, Colonel Kuhn, commanding the 3rd Panzer Brigade, hesitated. His soldiers would have no support if they charged ahead now. Instead of the second charge, the battle stalled. The French held the line. The line held. By early afternoon, the German command was scrambling. The 35th Panzer Regiment had suffered heavy losses. One German officer who commanded the 7th Panzer Division, Oberstleutnant Friedrich Eberbach, seeing the situation unfold, told his subordinates, quote, "Further advance is simply impossible. Our tanks sit, and before the obstacles, the defense fire strikes us mercilessly." The words were blunt, but they reflected the harsh reality of the battlefield. Momentum had stalled, and the French defenses were holding strong. The Luftwaffe was then called in for air support at 2 p.m., engines howling as they lined up for their bombing runs. But French anti-aircraft guns and scrambling fighters tore into their formations, flak bursts rocking the sky. Stukas veered off course, bombs falling wide, while German pilots struggled to regroup under relentless fire from below. Meanwhile, on the ground, the French defenders stood firm, among them the battle-hardened Moroccan division of the French 4th Corps. These colonial troops, known for their resilience and skill in defensive warfare, braced themselves as the German assault intensified. The Moroccan division fought with an intensity that caught the Germans off guard. The 7th Moroccan Regiment in Arnage and the 110th Infantry Regiment in Perbay held their ground against the panzers, unleashing relentless fire. Machine guns chattered as French soldiers cut down wave after wave of advancing Germans, determined to keep their positions intact. But the 2nd Moroccan Regiment had no such advantage. Caught in the open, they were hammered by Stuka dive bombers and tank fire. Explosions tore through their ranks, wiping out entire platoons as they scrambled for cover. Survivors ran for safety, their retreat turning desperate as German armor closed in, leaving no room for resistance. The battle was turning into a slog. And yet, despite their initial success, the Germans were stalling. The 4th Panzer Division's momentum had been broken. The 3rd Panzer Division was now caught in the open, unable to advance without infantry support. Their tanks, vulnerable to French anti-tank fire, were forced to take cover. Above, the Luftwaffe, struggling to gain the upper hand, attempted another bombing run. Once again, the French anti-aircraft defenses were effective. The bombers took damage, and the French airmen fought back fiercely, shooting down several German planes. As the afternoon wore on, the French counterattacked. The Moroccan division launched a series of retaliatory strikes against the German positions. Tanks from the French 3rd DLM led the charge. Their tanks, armed with the robust Hotchkiss H-35s, pushed forward, firing on the German infantry and armored units. The French tanks made contact, but the Luftwaffe was already in the sky. Bombers swooped down on the French lines, scattering the advancing forces. The tanks, without infantry support, were vulnerable to German anti-tank fire. The attack faltered. The French tanks retreated, unable to fight effectively without infantry, and the Germans regained the positions they had lost. By 6:30 p.m., the last French efforts to break the German line had collapsed. The Germans, despite their initial failure, had managed to hold the line. They had suffered heavy losses, but the French had also been unable to break through. Both sides had paid a heavy price, but the Germans had failed to gain the quick, decisive victory they had hoped for. As night fell, the German forces were regrouping, preparing for another attempt. The French forces, battered and exhausted, were also waiting, ready for whatever came next. Finally, at 8 p.m., the German command issued new orders. The advance was to continue the next day. A battle of attrition. The second day of fighting began early. At 7:30 a.m., the Germans launched another barrage of artillery, pounding the French positions near Perbay and Arnage, small Belgian villages located just east of Gembloux. Stukas screamed down in waves, their bombs flattening defensive positions. But despite the heavy bombardment, the French held firm. Now, the 4th Panzer Division began their forward surge at 8 a.m. The tanks rumbled across the battlefield, searching for weak spots in the French defenses. As before, the French were ready. Anti-tank guns opened fire as soon as the tanks appeared. The French artillery, positioned in strategic locations, fired relentlessly, targeting the advancing German tanks. The Germans responded with more bombs, more fire, but it wasn't enough. The tanks were knocked out one by one. 2 hours into the day's fighting, another fierce battle was getting underway near Otigny, northeast of Gembloux, and further behind the French defensive positions at Ernage and Perbay. There, the German Fourth Corps found themselves locked in combat and struggling to maintain any semblance of cohesion while under heavy French counterfire. The Luftwaffe was called in to support the Fourth Corps, but it was unable to gain air superiority and struggled to provide support for the second day in a row. The Germans could not break through. By noon, it was clear the battle was becoming a war of attrition. The French held the high ground, making any German advance difficult. At 4 p.m., French reinforcements arrived to stabilize the line. General Millier, riding in on a motorcycle under fire, rallied the men to continue the fight. It was in this state of underdog exuberance that at 4:30 p.m., the French launched a final counterattack. French tanks and infantry surged forward, but once again, the Luftwaffe intervened. Bombers rained destruction down on the French forces. By nightfall, the battlefield was littered with burning wrecks and the shattered remnants of both forces. Despite being outnumbered and poorly supported by their own command, the French had given the Germans a run for their money. The battle for Gembloux was over. Not lost, but not fully won either. The German forces suffered heavy losses, with the 4th Panzer Division losing around 45 to 50% of its armored vehicles, while the 3rd Panzer Division lost approximately 20 to 25% of its AFVs. In total, the Germans incurred between 2,000 and 3,000 casualties. On the French side, the Moroccan Division bore the brunt of the fighting, particularly the 1st Battalion, 2nd Regiment, which was decimated, reducing from 700 men to just 74. The total French casualties amounted to around 1,500. Gembloux had stopped the Germans. For now, that was enough. As one historian put it, quote, "The Allied success at Gembloux was nullified by the German victory further south, but Reichenau's failure to destroy or at least defeat the Allied corps de bataille at Gembloux was critical. It is true that the Allied High Command proved unable in the days following to use the corps de bataille to restore the Allied front. In other words, the French had won a battle, but the Germans were still winning the war."